That's great. Thanks so much. And thanks for accommodating my change in schedule. I have a doctor's appointment that I need to make, so I will dip out and then come back very briefly. But I'm grateful for the recording because I'm very excited for Danielle's presentation as well. Can you see all of my slides? Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, fab. So I'm gonna be sort of introducing the session today. So oftentimes when I present to business and marketing students, I have to do a little bit of a spiel about just how bad things are. Those of you who are based in the UK and Europe at the moment, don't need this spiel. This was a map taken a couple of years ago from the 2022 heatwave, but I may as well have updated it with the temperatures today. It's going to look very similar this week, and I was in Germany last week, and it was very similar. Extremely high temperatures for this time of year. And that's sort of a pattern that we're seeing around the world. Huge weather shifts, huge climate impacts, largely due to human activity and burning of fossil fuels, essentially. And so we can look at this on a kind of global scale. We have, like, I'm from the UK presenting today, Danielle is from the US. We are two countries that experience quite significant climate impacts. I think Danielle's going to present a sort of global mega study as well. So we'll get more of the international feel in that second talk. But for my first talk, I'm going to focus in a little bit more on the individual and the local stories. So to bring it back to me, this is a picture taken last year in the town where I live. It's a small town called Bradford-on-Avon. It's a historic walled town. And this is the central town bridge. The town is separated by a river, which is usually quite shallow. And every single year now it floods, largely due to climate impacts that are getting worse and worse. So this is an international affair, but it is also something that we are already feeling on a very local basis. And often, like, I used to teach this. My background is in psychology, so I used to teach climate change by saying, climate change is happening to people far away from us who live very different lives to us. The worst impacts are going to happen to the most disadvantaged within society. And that's still very much true, but all of us are becoming a lot closer to the impacts of climate change. This is not something that's happening far away. It's happening to all of us in our local communities all around the world. So you already know that you're part of the environment group, so you're probably wondering, well, how do we get out of this? And according to the IPCC, which is the sort of intergovernmental panel on climate change, the sort of leading authority of scientists working on climate change and climate action, they have these kind of different pathways for change. And all pathways for limiting continued global warming involve a huge amount of behavior change from individuals. That behavior change is largely around fossil fuel reductions, but it's also around dietary changes, transport shifts, changes in consumption, lots of different things. And they have developed some scenarios that include techno fixes, but we just don't have carbon capture at the scale that we need currently. So we are depending almost entirely on shifts in industry, shifts in individual behaviors at the sort of individual, societal, and organizational level. And for this reason, a lot of environmental social scientists like myself have been kind of arguing that we really need to be thinking about people as the heart of climate action. So to quote from this great paper, which I highly recommend, transformation requires infrastructure and design choices that are considered systematically as an interplay between individual behavior, cultural processes, corporate action, institutions, and infrastructural change. So we need this kind of systems level thinking if we're going to address any of the polycrisis, because climate change is not just an environmental issue, it's also very much a social justice issue. So, given the urgency, given all the information that we have about why action is needed, how we can do it, why aren't more people acting against climate change? Why don't we see climate action in the majority of the population in certain spaces? In some spaces we do, but in most of the population, we don't see a lot of climate action. Danielle might correct me on the exact figures of that. But for the most part, some dietary changes, some transport shifts, like, getting taking Interrail trains for your summer holidays. Love that decision. I try and do that as much as I can as well. But these are minority pursuits, right? They're done by not everyone, unfortunately. And one of the reasons for that is that change is really difficult, even for those, and especially for those who are highly motivated. So I have a paper that I worked on with Chris Bryant and Julie Barnett. Chris wrote this massive, massive paper as part of his PhD, kind of summarizing a lot of the individual differences and the impacts that we see when we sort of engage in climate action and the kind of barriers that we might face. And we argue that there are just so many barriers at every single stage of behavior change. So before you're thinking about changing your behavior, there are barriers of ignorance. You might not have enough information. You might be avoiding information. When you start thinking about changing your behavior, there's loads of barriers as well. When you're preparing, you're working against habits. When you're acting, you're coming into these kind of social contexts which aren't very friendly to you. There are lots and lots of different social barriers that activists face throughout the sort of life cycle of their continued activism. Now, I am a qualitative researcher primarily. I do some mixed methods, so I focus a lot on sort of individual cases or specific types of activism. And for the most part of my career thus far, I've been looking at diet and specifically veganism. And the work that I've done in collaboration with, my PhD supervisors, but led by Tim Kurtz, who's at the University of Western Australia, argues that these identities around diet, around transport, around these habits aren't just about the practices. They're actually quite complicated because they're moral pursuits fundamentally, or they're perceived as having a moral nature. So someone who is vegan might be seen by others to be vegan for a moral reason, or might be seen to be preachy to others. Even if that's not the intent, there's a sort of assumed morality associated with a lot of these identities that can pose really, really big problems for social interaction. They're minority practices within society. They're focused around practices, which, as we discussed, are quite hard to maintain for a variety of reasons. And they also create these sort of identity groups, which, creates an in-group and an out-group and sort of lots of different issues around the labels that we're using. And what I've been working on for a while is thinking about focusing on the people who are doing climate action and trying to understand their experiences so that we can sort of broaden out their perspectives to apply for to lots of different folks. And what I've learned from studies that I've done over the past decade is that climate action is exhausting. Like any type of social action is truly exhausting for the activists involved. There are so many barriers. I've also looked at this in the sort of open science and research transparency domain. It is the same thing. The biggest risk to social movements is losing these passionate, motivated folks because they're just so exhausted. So if you're interested in hearing more about the sort of open science experience, we created this zine using meerkats as a kind of metaphor for finding community and dealing with exhaustion. But it's really important that we find strategies for getting around this. This is one of the pages from the zine. This is an activist who's thinking about what they need to do and what they have to do, and maybe wondering that they're alone and that nobody cares. This is maybe a familiar sort of process for a lot of us. And we could categorize this as burnout. So for those of you who don't know, burnout is typically defined as a kind of occupational hazard around three primary dimensions. So it's around exhaustion. So you are physically, emotionally, and mentally exhausted and unable to work, unable to motivate yourself. You're very cynical, like so cynicism is the second one, where you're just kind of, you don't really see the value in what you or other people are doing. And inefficacy, the idea that what you're doing doesn't matter. And we've had a bunch of responses to these kind of visual representations of burnout. One of them was someone said they didn't expect a meerkat to read their mind. So these kind of like, yeah, this resonates with a lot of us, unfortunately. And I'm doing some work sort of investigating the prevalence of burnout in these populations. Okay. So I went from the stage of, in my PhD, looking at, it's very hard to be an activist. What can we do for activists to bring folks together? And I've done a lot of research in my career looking at the power of events for this. So I was actually, the story with this paper is quite interesting because I'm friends with a bunch of vegans. I try and eat as vegan as possible. And out of the blue, a couple of my friends messaged me and was like, oh, there's this vegan campout festival. Do you want to go? And the researcher in me was just like, what? Like, this is amazing. Because I've been thinking about how vegans are in this societal minority. It's so tough to exist in this sort of space where you're not catered for, where you're not seen. And this was a sort of temporary utopia where veganism was the majority and where you could not have to think about what you were eating, you could just interact. So I decided that I wanted to go to the vegan campout. I wanted to experience it. I wanted to interview people to see the kind of impacts an event like this with that temporary social majority could have on these exhausted activists. And this work is published open access in political psychology. So you can read the whole thing if you like, but I'm going to give you some of the top lines. So we did a bunch of interviews at the event, like sort of towards the end of the event as people were packing up. I was roaming around the campsite trying to get people's opinions. And we asked them about their experiences of the event, and we found sort of these four interconnected themes. So first off, we found that the event sort of helped people recharge, helped them restore their identity, reconnect to their veganism and their motivations. So sort of addressing that cynicism component. They found the value in what they were doing again because they were connecting with so many people. We found that people were building better, stronger vegan social networks. They were meeting new folks, they were making new friends, they were joining new networks within their local communities. And with this came an additional sort of psychological connection to the group that was protective in terms of helping people stay engaged, giving people opportunities to get advice from other folks. And as a result, some folks wanted to go further in their action and activism. And part of this was the programming. So there were multiple activist workshops and talks about what you can get involved with. It's worth saying that this research was conducted at the event. We are still looking at whether these kind of impacts work longitudinally, whether this is something that activists need to do on a regular basis to kind of maintain these impacts. This is a one-shot study, so I'm hoping Danielle can sort of fill in some of the quant aspects there, but very much a work in progress. But it was really interesting for us to see how this one event, this one joyous festival could shape people's experiences. And to give you a kind of idea of how significant this was for some folks. So here we have quotes from Carol and Jane, who were two, I think, slightly older women, or sort of middle-aged women, who were talking about the significance of not having to worry about seeing meat cooked in front of them, and sort of going like, someone in the campsite was saying, "Who wants sausages?" I was thinking, "Oh no, I'm going to smell them." Like they're already anticipating this kind of conflict and judgment and this point of tension. But then they realized, oh, they're all vegan. You don't have to worry about that. And they kept like sort of defaulting to asking whether everything was vegan and then stopping themselves, and the kind of joy, you don't have to worry about that. You can relax and talk about other stuff. And I think there's a sort of impression that climate activists, particularly vegans, are very preachy and they like to talk about their veganism. But from my research, what I've often found out is that they just want to get on with their lives and they just want to have access to these kind of environments where they don't have to constantly argue and justify themselves. And here's another extract from Luca. So Luca was an Italian participant who I met in one of the queues for coffee on the final day. He was talking about how the kind of social impacts of his veganism were such that his family had a really tough time, like accepting him. And Luca had taken the Liberation Pledge, which, for those of you who don't know, some vegans wear this sort of folded fork around their wrist and sort of commit to never eating at a table or in an environment where food, meat or dairy is being served. So these are very extreme kind of exclusionary. But then Luca was sort of talking about how that boundary and that exclusion was necessary for him to maintain his sort of like mental health. And here Luca was talking about how the camp out itself, the celebration was good for his health, and about how it's sort of they suffer so much for the animals. So these kind of interconnected crises are not just they're not just neutral information, right? These are very emotional and evocative things that have a real impact on us as people. And we need chances to let that out and to talk about it and to decompress with like-minded others. That can be really, really important. Okay, so just to finish off, I'm also going to give a little bit of a teaser into some of the other research I'm working on at the moment, or I've worked on over the past couple of years, looking at different aspects, different facets of identity. So we've done some work looking at meat consumption in men, looking at how male identity is really tied into um, meat consumption, even though a lot of men don't like to talk about that. They'll kind of, in the focus groups we did, they denied that meat had any, that their gender had any impact on their meat consumption. But then in the sort of quantitative survey that we did, we found that masculine norms were highly linked to sort of meat and dairy consumption and meat connection as well. So there's a sort of tension between what people are saying and what people are feeling. But this quote I felt was really significant. So this was someone who was talking about, oh, gender doesn't influence what I eat. But if I go out to eat with alpha males, I'll feel, a slight obligation. I'll feel safer behind choosing something like a burger or a steak than a pasta or a salad. So diet is not just diet, right? Diet is wrapped up with lots of different cultures, lots of different identities, your social group, your social interactions. It is not just, something that you do. And it was interesting with this paper actually because I did some press around it, and the Daily Mail picked up my conversation article, which was very interesting. I didn't get to choose the headline, but they went with a headline that basically proved my point. And then all the comments were just men like getting really angry that I'd even tried to associate meat with masculinity. So that was good fun. And more recently, I've been looking at sort of demographic identities and how they link to climate adaptation. I have a PhD student, Holly Karkaldi, who is brilliant, is doing amazing work on this. And we've had a paper just accepted in Nature MPJ Climate Action, really highlighting that these kind of adaptation techniques and these climate actions are not built with neurodivergent, with disabled folks in mind. There are huge barriers when it comes to sort of climate adaptation when you consider multiple identity groups. Also, Holly is amazing, so I highly recommend connecting with her on LinkedIn or getting in touch if you're interested in this kind of thing. She is brilliant. So to conclude, I've gone a tiny bit over, but I hope I sort of shed light into some of the sort of interpersonal experiences that climate activists and particularly vegans have. And I just want to say that this sort of, we need both sides of the coins, right? We need to look at behavior change, but we also need to look at system change. It is not just about placing the blame on individuals, it's about understanding individuals' experiences and then shaping systems so that we can better serve the people, in my opinion. Anyway, thank you so much. Thank you for adjusting this. I'm sorry I have to dip out in a second, but I'm very happy to connect with people on LinkedIn and Blue Sky. And I also have an Instagram now, which is my students are helping me manage because I am too old for this. But yeah, thank you so much. I'll stick around for some questions. Thanks, everyone.